It was 1975, in a packed Memphis arena. Halfway through an American trilogy, Elvis stopped. His hand rose, the band froze. 16,000 people went silent. In the front row, a mother clutching a folded flag. The king stepped forward and changed the night. Stories like this remind us why music isn't just sound. It's memory, honor, and love. Stay with me, because what Elvis does next is something people still talk about 50 years later. The first note hadn't even hit when the floor began to tremble. It was a late summer night in 1975, Memphis, Tennessee. The Mid-South Coliseum was packed shoulder to shoulder, nearly 16,000 fans. The smell of popcorn and cologne hung in the air. Programs rustled. You could feel the anticipation buzzing like static before a storm. The house lights dimmed. A low hum from the amps crept through the speakers. Then the blinding white of the spotlights snapped on, cutting through the haze. From stage left, Elvis Presley stepped into view. White jumpsuit, gold belt glinting with every movement, hair perfectly in place despite the heat. The roar that followed was a physical force, like standing in front of a jet engine. People surged to their feet, screaming his name. Without a word, he swung the mic stand into position. The horns blasted the opening of CC Rider. Drums pounded. The floorboards under the front rows vibrated in time, but in the middle of that electric chaos, something didn't fit. Just beyond the lip of the stage, second seat from the aisle, a woman sat absolutely still, no clapping, no smile. Her hands were folded in her lap around something dark and triangular. Under the glare of the spotlight, it was unmistakable, a folded American flag. The deep blue cloth patterned with white stars. According to people seated nearby, she hadn't moved since she sat down. Not even when the rest of the section jumped to their feet. Elvis spotted her before the first song ended. You could see it, a quick flick of his eyes, the way his head tilted for just a second, mid-verse. He didn't break pitch, but his gaze lingered there longer than anywhere else. The song wrapped with a blast from the brass section. The crowd roared, but as the applause thundered, a stagehand, lean, dark hair, wearing a black headset, stepped out from the wings. He leaned toward. Elvis murmured something just out of the mic's range. Whatever it was, it made Elvis's jaw tighten. His fingers shifted on the microphone, a subtle white-knuckle grip. He looked back at the woman. The next number was already cued. The band waiting for his nod. He gave it, but not without one more glance at that folded flag. The music swelled again, this time with "I Got a Woman." Fans clapped, swayed, and sang. But if you watched closely, you'd see it. Between lines, between guitar breaks, his eyes kept darting toward the front row. He sang, he smiled, but he was tracking her every move. Some say he barely registered the second song. Others recall that his voice carried an edge, not strained, but weighted, and when the final chord rang out, Elvis didn't pause to soak up the applause like usual. He pivoted to the bandleader, said something under his breath, and turned back to face the crowd. His eyes found hers again, and from that moment on, the night was no longer about the set list. He took a deep breath, nodded for the next song, but his attention never left that flag. Halfway through the anthem, the king froze. The band eased into an American trilogy, a song already heavy with meaning. The brass flared bright, the snare cracked in clean rolls, and Elvis's voice wrapped around the first verse like it was meant only for that room. But his eyes, they didn't scan the crowd like usual. They stayed locked on that folded flag. He sang the opening, Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. But the usual sway and half-smile were gone. His expression was still, focused. The second verse rose with the horns, the strings swelling under the melody. He took 2 steps forward, then it happened. Right at the crescendo, he lifted his left hand palm open, and the music stopped. Instantly, the horns cut. The drums went dead. The only sound was the faint hiss of the stage amps and a chair creaking somewhere in the balcony. You could almost hear the breath being held in the arena. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Someone in the back coughed. Elvis walked toward the very front of the stage until the toes of his boots met the edge. He looked down at the woman with the flag. People in the first rows turned toward her now, as if trying to see what he saw. Some witnesses say she tried to wave him off, a small shake of her head. But he didn't break eye contact. He lowered the microphone closer to his mouth. "Ma'am." His voice carried easily in the hush, deep and clear. "I need to ask, who are you here for?" The crowd stilled further, as if the answer itself was fragile. The woman clutched the flag tighter. Her lips trembled. She lifted it slightly toward the light. Then she said it. One name it didn't echo. It didn't need to. The people nearest to her repeated it under their breath, and it traveled in a low, somber wave through the section. Elvis's face didn't change at first. He just stood there, mic lowered now, head bowed slightly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he drew in a slow breath and straightened. The band, still frozen, waited for his cue, but it didn't come. Instead, he stepped down one riser toward the crowd, his boots catching the spotlight. He pointed to the security guard at stage right and made a small, sharp gesture. The guard, wearing a red blazer and earpiece, moved forward and leaned down to the woman. She hesitated, then allowed him to help her up. People shifted in their seats, parting like a slow tide as she was guided toward the side steps to the stage. Whispers followed her, some with tears already in there eyes, others holding hands over their mouths. When she reached the top of the stairs, Elvis met her halfway, extending a hand. She took it. The flag was still pressed to her chest. Up close, under the stage lights, you could see she was in her late 50s. Her eyes were rimmed red. Elvis led her to the center of the stage. The entire arena was silent. He lifted the microphone again, but this time his voice was quieter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he paused, eyes still on her. "This lady's here tonight for someone who couldn't be." A few heads bowed in the audience. "And before we go any further," he said, "we're gonna hear who that was." He turned slightly toward her, giving her the space to speak again. She adjusted the flag, took a breath, and spoke her son's story in one trembling sentence. The name wasn't just a name, it was the weight of a life cut short. Her voice was soft, but in the silence of the Mid-South Coliseum, it carried, "My son, Private First Class, Daniel Ross, 101st Airborne." She stopped, swallowing hard. Her free hand gripped the edge of the flag, knuckles pale. Elvis crouched slightly, lowering himself so their eyes were level. He wasn't smiling now, he just listened. "He was 22, she said, her voice trembling. "He was supposed to be here tonight." The words seemed to land differently than anything else said that evening. You could hear small gasps in the audience. A man in the third row bowed his head. Somewhere in the back, someone muttered, "Oh my God," she told him, in short halting sentences, that her son had been deployed overseas, that a roadside explosion had taken him just weeks earlier, that the concert ticket in her hand was the one he had bought for himself months before. The lights above the stage cast a faint halo on the flag. The brass section behind Elvis shifted in their seats, their instruments idle in their laps. Elvis reached out and gently took the folded flag from her hands. He cradled it in both arms as if it were fragile glass. Some say you could see his eyes glisten in that moment. He stood, turned slightly toward the crowd, and said into the microphone, "Then tonight, this song is for him." He glanced over, his shoulder at the band, but instead of giving the usual cue, he lifted the mic with one hand and held the flag against his chest with the other. And then, without music, he began to sing, "Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton." His voice was raw now, unaccompanied. Every imperfection carried, but that only made it stronger. People in the audience stood instinctively, some with hands over their hearts, others linking arms by the second verse. The emotion in his tone deepened. He closed his eyes. His foot tapped faintly against the stage floor, but he never moved from where he stood. The sound was intimate, stripped down, the kind of performance you might imagine happening in a small room, not a stadium. Yet every single person there could hear him as if he was singing directly to them. Halfway through, a lone violin eased in from the back of the band. Not the full arrangement, just a soft, mournful harmony that wrapped around Elvis's voice without overpowering it. The woman stood beside him the entire time, her head slightly bowed. Near the final verse, his voice cracked, not from strain, but from something deeper. He didn't hide it. He just kept going. The crowd didn't cheer between verses, didn't even murmur. They just listened. When the last note faded, Elvis didn't lower the microphone right away. He held the silence, a long, unbroken pause that felt like its own. Tribute then, slowly, he handed the flag back to her. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost off mic. The audience erupted into applause, but it wasn't the usual deafening cheer. It was slower, rising like a wave, people clapping through tears. Elvis placed a hand gently on the woman's shoulder, guiding her toward the edge of the stage. The security guard appeared again, helping her down the stairs to her seat. People reached out to touch her arm as she passed. Back on stage, Elvis stayed where he was for a moment, head down, mic at his side. Finally, he looked toward the band and gave a nod for the next song. But even as the first notes began, his mind clearly hadn't left the moment. The tribute wasn't over, not by a long shot. When the music returned, it didn't sound like a concert. It sounded like a prayer. For a few long seconds after the woman returned to her seat, Elvis stood motionless in the center of the stage. The house lights above glared hot on his shoulders, catching every bead of sweat at his hairline. The crowd waited. Then, without a word, he raised the microphone again. This time, he began an American trilogy from the very top, but not in the usual way. No horns, no pounding drums, just Elvis's voice. It was deep, steady, and aching with something you couldn't rehearse. The first line floated out into the arena, and people in the upper tiers leaned forward in their seats as if to catch every syllable on the front rows. Fans removed their hats. A few stood with their hands pressed to their hearts. Others simply lowered their heads, stopped by the second verse. The band eased in, not the full power they usually brought, but a soft, respectful swell. The bass rumbled faintly under his voice, and the brushes on the snare were barely more than a whisper every few seconds. Elvis glanced toward the woman in the second seat from the aisle. Her flag was back in her lap, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. The smell of popcorn was gone now, replaced by the faint tang of the hot stage lights and the mix of cologne and hairspray drifting from the crowd as the song built. So did the emotion. He wasn't just performing, he was delivering something directly to her. Then came the final chorus. Elvis stepped forward, holding the flag again. She must have handed it back mid-song and pressed it against his chest. His right hand gripped the mic. His left arm cradled the folded cloth as though it were a living thing. The last note hung in the air. He didn't move, didn't bow. The applause started small. A ripple from the back rows, then grew into a rolling wave. But Elvis didn't bask in it. Instead, he lowered the mic, walked to the edge of the stage, and stepped down from the riser to the floor. Security guards tensed but didn't move to block him. He walked directly to the woman's row. She stood as he approached, leaning close so only she could hear. He spoke a few words. Witnesses say she nodded, tears streaming freely now. Elvis took her hand in both of his for a moment longer, gave a small squeeze, then turned and climbed back onto the stage. The applause still rumbled, but it was softer than before, almost reverent. He returned the flag to her seat personally, setting it down gently on the chair before stepping back under the lights. For a moment, he looked toward the band. He gave the slightest nod, but instead of the next scheduled song, he motioned for the house lights to drop again. The arena dimmed to near darkness, and then nothing. No one came out. No music started, just the faint hum of amplifiers and the shuffle of restless feet. Minutes passed. People murmured, wondering if the show was over, but those closest to the stage could see it. Elvis had slipped backstage, and he wasn't done yet. When he returned, he wasn't empty-handed. When Elvis stepped back into the spotlight, the crowd gasped, not at his voice, but at what he was carrying. From the shadows at stage left, he emerged slowly. In his hands was a sunburst Gibson acoustic, the lacquer catching tiny flecks of light as he walked. The murmurs turned into a hush. Cameras flashed. He didn't stop at the microphone. He didn't even look at the band. Instead, he went straight to the edge of the stage, lowered himself onto one knee, and leaned down toward the second seat from the aisle. The woman stood as he approached, eyes wide. He held the guitar out toward her, speaking just loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. "He would have wanted you to have music," Elvis said. There was no dramatic pause, no build-up, just that one line, and then he placed the instrument into her hands. The applause hit instantly. It was sharp, loud, and full. People stood. Some clapped above their heads. Others just covered their mouths in disbelief. She held the guitar like it was made of crystal. The strap dangled loose, the strings humming faintly from the movement. Elvis rested his hand lightly on her shoulder for a moment before straightening and walking back to the center of the stage. When he reached the microphone, he waited for the applause to fade, just enough to speak for the rest of the night. He said, looking out across the sea of faces, "This seat in the front row belongs to a hero." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't rehearsed, but it carried to the very back wall of the Colosseum. The audience erupted again, this time not just for Elvis, but for the man whose name they'd heard minutes before. The band slid into the opening chords of "Can't Help Falling in Love." The melody was warm, familiar, but for many in that room, the real performance had already happened. Through the song, Elvis's eyes occasionally drifted to her. She was still holding the guitar, the folded flag resting carefully on her lap. When the final note faded, the lights softened, and Elvis gave a small bow. The crowd cheered, shouted his name, and waved programs in the air. But in that pocket of the front row, it felt different, quieter, heavier, yet strangely peaceful. As the house lights began to rise, people started to file out, buzzing about what they had just witnessed. The woman stayed seated for a moment, longer, running her fingertips along the curve of the guitar's body. She didn't know it yet, but the night wasn't over. A week later, her doorbell rang. 7 days later, the memory of that night walked right up to her front porch. It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang. The woman opened her front door to find no one standing there, just a rectangular guitar case resting against the frame. She stepped outside, scanning the street. Nothing, no car pulling away, no figure in the distance, kneeling. She flipped open the brass latches and lifted the lid. Inside was another Gibson rich sunburst finish, the wood grain glowing in the sunlight. But this one was different. Across the body, in gold ink, was a handwritten message: "You'll always have a seat in the front row." Elvis, her breath caught. She ran her fingers lightly over the signature, as if to make sure it was real. According to her family, that guitar never left her living room, while friends who visited said it hung where the afternoon light hid it. Next to the folded flag, the story of that night spread quietly among fans. Some read about it in letters. Others heard it from people who swore they were in the room. True or not, those who stood in the Mid-South Coliseum that evening say the silence that followed, Elvis's pause, was unlike anything they had ever felt. Not before and not since. Sometimes the greatest standing ovation is given to someone who isn't there to hear it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes music can honor the ones we've lost, who in your life deserves a seat in the front row.